Let's observe silence for some time. Oh, currently we are studying the sixth topic of chapter 1, the law of nature. And last week we read the first paragraph and it was explained. See, the main message in the first paragraph is you must lift yourself by yourself. Uddaret Atmanatmanam. This is what Bhagavad Gita says. Your life is your responsibility. You don't have to worry about what others are doing. And most people, they are heading in the wrong direction in life. When we say wrong direction, it does not mean unrighteous. If this is spiritual path, they are going in the opposite direction. They are completely caught up in the world of materiality and sensuality. And as a result, they end up collecting more desires. And what we have been told by all the scriptures, that our mission in life as a human being is to eliminate our desires with efforts, with spiritual efforts. Because desire is the barrier between human being and divinity. So desires obscure our divinity, which is our original nature. So due to ignorance, most people to begin with, they don't know this. So therefore, they try to find happiness in the world by acquisition and enjoyment, where it is not there. Nobody has found happiness through acquisition and enjoyment. But since majority are doing that, they follow the herd instinct. So therefore, you will have to put extraordinary efforts not to follow the herd instinct. That is number one. Number two, not many people, they are spiritual, religious. You can use any word. Yeah, they are worldly. And those who follow the spiritual path, hardly anybody goes to the philosophy of any religion. Any religion has got two aspects. There is philosophy, which is nothing but knowledge of life and living, and there are rituals. Nothing wrong with rituals, but they are meant for people who can't really think, whose intellect is weak. So they perform rituals with some basic understanding. That goes without saying. We're not talking about blind rituals here. But unfortunately, vast majority are caught up in blind rituals, mechanical rituals, or some superstitious beliefs or blind faith. See, I repeat, not many people follow spiritual path. Most people, they are completely caught up in the world of materiality and sensuality. Then there are handful of people, minority, they have some kind of inclination towards spiritual path, but they end up following either blind faith, mechanical rituals, or some superstitious beliefs. Hardly anybody goes to the knowledge aspect of any religion. So therefore, you will have to put efforts. This is the point. This is how we started the lecture. You must lift yourself by yourself. So there is no reference point for you. At home, there are chances that they have been following some mechanical rituals, superstitious belief. You go to a religious place where they're supposed to teach this knowledge. Very few religious places where they actually teach the philosophy. So where will you get this? So therefore, you need to put efforts to become a better human being and eventually to find out what's your real mission in life, which is to reach to the state of self-realization, which is your original state, my original state. So these are the main points in the first paragraph of the last topic, the law of nature. So are we okay with this?
Yes.
Then we read, I think, 3 paragraphs where he talks about the concept of likes and dislikes. But I don't think it was explained, right? We just read. Okay. So likes and dislikes, they are called as raga dveshas in Sanskrit. Now you are born with certain likes and dislikes, number one. And also you acquire likes and dislikes in your life. Now there is nothing wrong in having likes and dislikes. But if you act on likes and dislikes without using your intellect, then the problem starts. And right from the young age, we collect these likes and dislikes. To begin with, parents, they infuse likes and dislikes in their children, you know. Honey, don't like this, don't eat it. I will order something else for you. I'm giving you a simple example. So they are pampered right from the young age. Parents, they indiscriminately they pamper the children. They keep on catering to their likes and dislikes. So you grow up maybe 10, 12, again, relatives or friends, everybody around you is feeding your likes and dislikes. You get into a relationship, entire relationship is based on likes and dislikes. If you don't cater to your spouse's likes and dislikes, all hell can break loose. Because right from the young age, we have been acquiring them. Raga dveshas, these likes and dislikes. So by the time you become 17, 18, 20, whatever, you are nothing but a bundle of likes and dislikes. So you do what you like and you avoid what you do not like. And that can interfere in all facets of your life, mainly your obligations. Oh, I'm feeling very lazy today. Today is Sunday, so I don't feel like taking this class. I can say that. Whether I am feeling like that, I mean, even if I'm feeling lazy, I better take this class. I'm giving you an example. It's my obligation. I don't like to work on weekends. It's a common problem. I'm not saying you should work on the weekends, but if it is your obligation, if there is some emergency, there is a deadline for your project, you have to work on it. You have to work, whether you like it or not. So do what you ought to do as per your intellectual assessment in all facets of life. This is the way you tackle the problem of likes and dislikes. You use your intellect and you assess yourself. Am I supposed to eat this particular food? I mean, especially on a class day when I have class early in the morning, I'm very careful. I'm just giving you an example. Eat very light food, you know. Sometimes I may skip breakfast. I may feel like having heavy breakfast, but I know I have a presentation to make, so I should be fresh. So therefore, I have to be careful, isn't it? So what he's telling us, in fact, this is from chapter 18 of Bhagavad Gita, that what is pleasant in the beginning turns out to be unpleasant in the end. And what seems unpleasant to begin with turns out to be pleasant in the end. Yeah, I repeat, it's there in the book, but I'm just explaining. So this is how we all are deceived by life. That what gives instant pleasure turns out to be unpleasant in the end. And what seems unpleasant to begin with turns out to be pleasant. But since we don't understand this because our intellect is weak, nobody has taught this to us, consequences could be deadly, isn't it? Living beyond your means is so pleasant. You can most people straight away they start their life, they plunge into life, 21, 22, 23, that age, with a loan. Instead of buying a car, which is like simple and functional. Good many people, I'm not saying all are doing that, they will go for a luxury car. There's nothing wrong in buying a good car, but when you earn enough, that you can't start your life with that. I'm just giving you one example. There are 100 things. So it is so pleasant to live beyond your means, but what happens in the end? It doesn't need any explanation. Wasting your time as a youth is so pleasant. But once you lose your youth, it is gone. If you don't study, if you're not consistent, you bunk classes, you're in the wrong company, all that. It gives pleasure, But But what happens in the end? Sometimes you may lose your entire life. You can't recover. Junk food gives pleasure. Nobody can deny that. But what happens in the end? But to eat healthy food is not pleasant to begin with. Then whole life you are free from disease. To take to the spiritual path, nobody likes it. Keep on saying here, get up in the morning, study, get up in the morning and study. But how many of us are actually doing that? It's not pleasant. Get up at 4:15, 4:30, or whatever time you are comfortable. But once you get a taste of that life, you study in the morning, no, it's so tender that time. Your entire life is transformed. So any kind of disciplined life is not pleasant to begin with, isn't it? But it turns out to be what? To begin with, it is unpleasant. Disciplined life. But if you are disciplined in all facets of your life, what happens in the end? What happens?
It is a pleasant later on.
It is pleasant. The whole life turns out to be so beautiful. So you need to understand this and you need to put efforts to cultivate this. This is the point. And it's not easy. Why it is not easy? Why it is not easy to be disciplined? Why you need to cultivate this? Already I explained, but still I'm asking.
Because of,
herd instinct.
or because of a weak intellect.
Herd instinct, weak intellect, correct. What else?
No trained since childhood because of our effect of the world and the family and all that likes and dislike, and you don't use thinking.
Hmm?
Get used to the instant gratification.
Period. It's quite straightforward.
I think sometimes part of our practice is to be human and forget that we are not perfect, so that we get lost in, like what some of us have said, our weaknesses and our desires. But then classes like this help us remind us daily to remember that we have weaknesses and desires, to be aware of those things so that we can be more mindful.
Correct. All these are correct answers. So the main problem is the contradiction. What is that contradiction? That what gives you instant pleasure to begin with turns out to be unpleasant in the end. And what seems unpleasant to begin with turns out to be pleasant in the end. So we all are fooled by this. Therefore, we had to be taught this concept, this principle, and then we need to put efforts to cultivate this in our life, all facets of our life. It's a simple, straightforward concept, but very, very important. See, they are not telling us that you should not have likes and dislikes. As a human being, naturally you will have likes and dislikes. There's nothing wrong in having likes and dislikes. But when they interfere with your obligations in life, then you need to use your intellect and overpower your likes and dislikes. Number one. And when they are harmful to you, your likes and dislikes, then again you need to use your intellect and educate yourself. You need to lecture to yourself But if I continue with this particular like or dislike, it may harm me in the end. It could be perhaps detrimental to me in the end. So these are the main points as far as likes and dislikes are concerned. So any doubts?
Veera has a doubt on it.
Amiji, Hariom,
Where
when
are
will,
you? Oh, you're right next to me. Okay.
Yes. when will we know that as we right, I mean, you said that once if it's not detrimental and down the line it'll be good, but once anything that is good down the line it'll be detrimental. When will we know that, you know, whatever we're doing is detrimental? Like what? Because what I'm trying to understand is if it's immediate, it's fine, but down the line, if you know that it's detrimental, would have lost that kind of time. That how is it possible for us to, I mean, of course, use the intellect as one part of this story, but how can we identify it at the earliest to make sure we are going the right direction? Amiji?
No, you cannot. That's the whole point. So therefore, he says everybody is deceived by this contradiction. This is how we started off by saying, unless and until somebody educates us on this concept, how are we going to come to know? It's not possible. So that is what we see happening in the world. 99% human beings, they are victims of their own likes and dislikes. There is no way they are going to learn. And I think somewhere he says, I think he quotes Alexander Pope, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. It's a very famous quotation. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. How will you educate people? You cannot. We are supposed to know it. Forget about other people. Are you applying this in your day-to-day life? So you need to examine your likes and dislikes. That is a practical way to go about, provided you know the concept. The right thing to do would be to prepare your own list of your own likes and dislikes at all levels of your personality, starting material level. These are my expenses. I like to do this. I like to buy that. There's nothing wrong. But do I have income supporting that? When it comes to physical level, what are my likes and dislikes? Prepare a list. Emotional level, again, what I like, what I don't like. Why do I hate certain people? You know, likes and dislikes. Intellectual level, same thing. You need to prepare a list of your main likes and dislikes, and then you examine them. If it is not interfering with your life, if it is not harmful, it is not interfering with your obligatory duties, it is okay. Discreetly you need to handle. For example, you like to eat dessert once in a while. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as it is not interfering with your health. You know, use your intellect and once in a while fulfill that desire. What's wrong with that? Simple example I'm giving you. You want to buy, I don't know, some electronic at home, something, some gadget you want to buy. What's wrong with that? If TV is old in the house, obviously you need a nice TV. As long as you can afford it. Some TV, $15,000 TV, do you really need it? As opposed to $2,000, $3,000, you know? Is it interfering with my finances? Like that, you need to examine. But there's nothing wrong in likes and dislikes per se. That's not they are telling us. As a human being, I repeat, naturally you will have likes and dislikes. You need to examine them, use your intellect, and go about.
Deepaji has a question.
Yeah.
Please unmute your mic.
If you are capable of buying the big house or luxurious car or a big TV, you are affordable, it is affordable, you buy it. But there is no limit of that. There is always something better comes in the market. Don't it create that moment? You think, yes, I'm capable, but I don't need it. Or that thing, because even if you are capable, still there has to be some line drawn by intellect. Do you really need it? Yes, I will get very happy if I buy. So I'm looking the happiness outside all the time.
Correct. No, you're mixing two concepts. See, your explanation boils down to not acting on your likes and dislikes. Just because you can afford that doesn't mean you keep on indulging in that. Same thing. But that does not mean you deny. So therefore, I gave like simple example, like, your TV in the house is 10 years old, your car is, let's say, 8 to 10 years old. And you need you need a car. And you can afford whatever car you want to buy. Safe car, reliable car. So what's wrong in buying that? You like particular brand. Let's say you like Lexus. What's wrong with that? That is different from changing your car every year. Just because you can afford it. You see the difference. So that is still acting on your likes and dislikes. That is where you need to use your intellect. See why I gave this example, that you should not feel that you have to deny yourself everything. The moment we talk about likes and dislikes, it could be misconstrued that just because you like something, that does not mean you can't have it. No, it doesn't mean that way. Just examine your likes and dislikes. If you feel it is really necessary, why not? But use your intellect. So it's a good analysis, Deepaji. So the moment you feel you are getting sucked into that, use your intellect. Are we clear?
Yeah, it is a relative terms.
Sorry?
It is a relative terms because if you are capable, okay, somebody will say every 3 years, 5 years, so it is a relative terms. And as long as it is running 10 years old car, nothing wrong into that. To continue that, in my mind, it came because you feel happiness is there to buy a new car after 5 years or that. But ultimately, if it is running, don't look the happiness outside, it is within. So likes and dislikes don't depend on the happiness, but it is within. Ultimately, we have to, by scripture or your lecture, we have to understand that this is a necessity, we are buying that. But otherwise, happiness is within.
See, that's what I told you. You're mixing two concepts here. There is no happiness in the external world is a different concept. Right now, we are not discussing that. We are just discussing likes and dislikes. That is where you are going wrong. You're mixing two different concepts here. Get my point?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is group okay?
Yeah, Sachdeva uncle has a question.
Yeah, please.
Amiji, so when it's magnified to an expensive home and expensive car, it's easier to understand. I'm thinking of the day-to-day things examples: smoking, drinking, eating, candy, bad food. The affordability usually is not even in question. And it gives us instant pleasure. There's no knowledge, even attempt to look into the ill effects of these things. How does one approach, your day-to-day life, parties, this and that, how to approach that?
You cannot. That was, I think, Veera's question. See, if you are ignorant, then you cannot. You will be victimized by your likes and dislikes, and this is what everybody is doing. Ignorant people are doing.
Okay.
I think in the book he says in the beginning, by the time you are 18, 19, 20, you are nothing but a stockpile of likes and dislikes. So that becomes a motor which propels all your actions, from small to big actions. Everything is propelled by likes and dislikes. So for ignorant people, there is no chance. This is how their life is. Their whole life they are victimized by likes and dislikes, and they are paying a heavy price. And even after paying the heavy price, they are not waking up.
Mm.
But we are talking about people like you and me who have the knowledge. So therefore, use your intellect and override your likes and dislikes.
Thank you.
So are we okay? Now, the next few paragraphs, he's going to talk about the law of karma briefly. And in that, he's giving an example. It's a fascinating example. In fact, it is a story from Puranas. Puranas is nothing but the knowledge of Vedanta explained in the story form. It is basically for people who can't think. So every story has got a moral, but the way these stories are explained, if you take them literally, you will get into absurdity, and that's what most people they do. Intentionally, they magnify, they exaggerate, they give some funny or sometimes weird twist to make us think. So he is going to give us a sample of that with that story. But if you understand that, you will understand what is law of karma, what is law of causation. And I think next chapter also, he gives that story of a Pativrata. All these are stories from Puranas. So I repeat, all these stories, they have a moral. But if you approach these stories without knowledge, you will get into absurdity. That's what most people do. But when it is backed by this knowledge and then you read these stories, it has that powerful impact on you, because knowledge is so subtle. You can't take heavy knowledge all the time. You need poem, you need some quotations, you need some stories. Then it helps to digest the knowledge. So let's read next 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then I'll explain the main points. Raji, please.
From a young age, you must learn and follow a disciplined way of living. You then set your life right towards peace and progress. The law of karma states you reap what you sow. You would do well to follow this impeccable law of life. However, in spite of living a disciplined life, you may encounter certain inexplicable damage. In such exceptional cases, understand that loss as a result of a cause you're not aware of. You may pass over it and not let it perturb you. One can never fathom the underlying benevolence of nature. A simple story illustrates this truth. In one of the states in India, a royal couple was ably assisted by a wise old minister. The king had a regard for his loyalty and service rendered to the state. However, the minister had a peculiar mannerism of commenting on every event, be it good or bad. It's all by the grace of God. On one occasion, the prince of the state went on a shikar, hunting expedition, and lost his toe by accident. He returned to the palace with excruciating pain. As he was being treated, the king sent for his minister. The old man came and saw the tragic sight and exclaimed, "It's all by the grace of God." The prince flew into a rage, but withheld himself because of the king's great regard for the old man. The traumatic experience thus passed away. A year later, the prince sported with his friend on another shikar. On this occasion, the two young hunters were chasing an animal on horseback. The animal was swift, and soon they were lost in the thick of the jungle. Further, to their dismay, they found themselves amidst a tribe who were preparing for a ritualistic ceremony. The tribe believed in human sacrifice, and the true intruders were the greatest gift they could offer to God. So they stripped the two boys and fastened them to the poles for the sacrifice. And the last traditional rite was for the tribal chief to examine the offerings to God. The chief approached them and was dismayed to find a distinct flaw in one of the offerings. The prince's toe was missing. The chief instantly rejected him and ordered his release. The prince sprang up, mounted his horse, and rushed to the palace. He straight went to the minister, bowed down to him reverentially, and narrated his encounter with the tribe. The old man merely uttered, "It's all by the grace of God." Such is the way of life. One's business lies in performing one's obligatory duty and responsibility and leaving the rest to providence.
So it's a funny story. See, if you read this story without the knowledge, what do you understand? That's what people do. That's what I cautioned you. So what is telling us that life functions on law of causation, law of karma. Karma means action, law of action. Law of action is based on law of causation. Whole world, entire universe functions on law of causation. For every cause, there is an effect. For every effect, there is a cause. Like mathematical precision, it functions. If you do something positive, you will be positive in life. If you do something negative, you will be visited by negative things in life. So it is your own doing. You reap what you sow. We often give this example. You plant apple tree, you will get apples. You plant orange tree, you will reap oranges. If your life is based on, is positive, righteous throughout your life, you will be rewarded by righteous things in life. If you're unrighteous, don't complain when things go wrong in your life. You deserved it. So you get what you deserve. That is law of karma, law of causation. But sometimes this is where people they say, oh, that person was so good. I've been so righteous throughout my life. In spite of that, such a thing happened in my life, isn't it? Often people they try, and usually people who are unrighteous they give this example to justify. It doesn't pay to be good and all that. I mean, he was paying his taxes. He never swindled government, this and that. In spite of that, see what happened to him. It doesn't pay to be good, so therefore I will keep on swindling IRS. I'll keep on doing whatever, hanky panky. That is understood. But what you need to understand is, see, just because something negative happens in your life, that does not mean there is a cause. There is no cause. Okay, what is the law? Unless there is a cause, there cannot be effect. Just because you do not know the cause, that does not mean there is no cause. Maybe you have been hurting your spouse your entire life. Emotionally, I am saying. Or could be anybody. Maybe your employee. Maybe a lady who comes in your house to clean. You have been rude to her, whatever it may be. You have kept a bird in a cage whole life, or a fish in a tank. It's difficult to see. I don't know. I think the other day I went somewhere. I forgot where. Yeah, in New Jersey. New Jersey, I had gone. My colleague, Gautam, he had to take some shot. So he was inside for 1 hour, and Ritika is Gautam's wife. She's my colleague. We all studied together in Vedanta Academy. So there was a lounge in the doctor's office, and there was a huge aquarium. And I say huge meaning whatever. And in that aquarium, there were at least 25, 30 fish. Both of us could not see that. If you have feelings, how can you see that? So we changed our position. Something like that you have been doing. Otherwise, you're a good person, you're a righteous person. So when something negative happens, see, you forget that you have kept that fish in a tank the entire life, or a bird in a cage. What must be their life? When you feel suffocated, when you go through some stress, something in your life, you may ask this question, why? What did I do? And generally, you have been a righteous person. But what about that action? Are you with me? It's like you swipe a credit card and then you forget about it. And then you see, oh my God, what is this? How come I've been charged $500? But when you examine the bank statement, oh yeah, there is something you paid for. Black Friday, you got excited and you forgot about it. Your account is debited. You may not know, but there is a cause. So understand this, that without cause, there cannot be an effect. You may not know the cause. That does not mean there is no cause. That is number one. First message in this example. And there are certain experiences in life, I'm talking about negative experiences, which are perhaps necessary for you to grow if you have this knowledge. For example, your body breaks down. It's not a good thing that your body breaks down, but then it could be as a wake-up call that I better take care of my body. Life is fine, but how can I neglect my health? When your body breaks down, it could act as a solid reminder that, hey, wake up. If you keep on neglecting your body, then there'll be a total collapse. So it seems negative, but in a way, it is a blessing from the nature. It's a wake-up call if you use it wisely. Sometimes you may go through extreme mental agitations. There might be some conflict, non-stop conflict. Could be at home, could be at work, could be anywhere. It's a warning that, hey, I better change myself. I don't want to live this kind of a life of mental agitation, stress, worry, anxiety. So it may help you to plunge deeper into the study of Vedanta. Otherwise, you could be taking it casually. See, one of my colleagues, like her father, he got a stroke at the age of 70. It happened 9 years back. He's 79 now. Very successful businessman, very dynamic man. He knew about the importance of this knowledge, but he never took to this knowledge. I mean, very, very superficial study. Once in a while, he'll open book and all that. And after he got a stroke, first we all thought he was going to die, but fortunately he survived. And only his head functions and the right hand functions. The rest of the body is paralyzed. He's confined to the wheelchair. So we had a video call with him few weeks back. And I was so surprised to see he was so cheerful. Yeah, to me, it came as a shock of, my God, how can man be so cheerful who is confined to a wheelchair? And he himself was saying 2-3 times, he said, this is the best thing which has happened to me in my life, as far as knowledge is concerned, spiritual growth is concerned. Otherwise, I would have never taken to this knowledge. He knew it his entire life, but he never. So he looked at it positively. So when you are visited by certain negative experiences or like you face challenges in life, right? Instead of cursing and lamenting, it could act as a wake-up call. But it is based on law of karma, law of cause and effect. Are you getting the link? You may blame others, you may curse others. That does not mean there is no cause. You go on hurting innocent animals. How can you escape? It is going to come back to you, whether you like it or not, whether you admit it or not, whether you understand it or not. It is going to come back to haunt you. Therefore, I give example: bird in a cage, fish in a tank. Not to talk about hurting innocent animals. For what? All that you put together, you understand you are showing a cause or causes. And when it boomerangs on you, you say, my God, why me? So understand that there is a cause for everything. You can't escape that. Just because you do not know the cause, that does not mean what?
That there is no cause.
That does not mean there is no cause. So that credit card example should help you. So it's a funny story, but with a powerful message. It is all by the grace of God. So that prince used to be like frustrated. Boy, everything by the grace of God, everything by the grace of God. Then finally understood. Yes, it is really due to the grace of God I survived. Otherwise, I would have died. So no need to be bogged down by negative or challenges of life. if you have this knowledge, it should act as a wake-up call.
Magdalena has a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So it seems like the law of karma is not only the A is causing B is causing C, the typical one, I buy this car, I have this expense, or I have to, take care of gas that is now expensive because I have, whatever tank size. But it's also applying to whatever you explained. It's like there doesn't need to be like a direct connection between the events, right? Meaning I treat an animal wrong, this might hunt me back somehow at some point in my work. I think that's my understanding. But does that mean, because it's like I'm eating animals, like I'm eating meat. Is this it's hard for me to understand right now. I understand that, you have to act positively in life and be of service and do good. But where do you draw the line? Like, does it mean because I'm eating meat, an animal has to be killed so I can eat that meat, even though I might choose the organic chicken that lived a happy life and was, killed in a human way, or let's say and so I'm trying to say, where do I draw the line? Or do I need to expect that law of karma will always bring something into my life because I'm eating an animal?
See, negative is negative, positive is positive. How can negative become positive, right? I'm just giving your own example without, I'm not being personal, don't misunderstand. Just because I justify negative thing, it does not become positive. Negative is negative, positive is positive. But life is, like you said, it's not like one action, one effect. See, it is a sum total of everything. Your bank balance is not one debit, one credit. You may go on debiting, and also you credit your account, right? Debit, credit, debit, credit. All that put together is your bank balance. So it is a sum total of all your transactions, banking transactions in life. You may withdraw money, you may deposit money, but withdrawal is withdrawal, deposit is deposit, isn't it? So the moment your withdrawal goes beyond your deposits, then you get into trouble. Then you owe money to the bank, isn't it? So the moment your deposits are more than the withdrawal, then your bank balance is in surplus. So that does not mean debit is not debit, credit is not credit. So you may justify debit, your expenses, whatever you may say. It was necessary, it was because of this reason, that reason. That does not make it a credit, isn't it? So similarly, you may justify, I may justify my negative action. Negative action is negative action. It will boomerang on you in life, whether you understand it or not, whether you like it or not. So how can you hurt an innocent animal and expect it will not boomerang on you in life? Only thing you and I are not able to correlate. That's the problem. Why this tsunami? Why this disease? Why this war in life? You read Swamiji's books, especially the book of quotations. He is clearly explaining that, and so many Western philosophers he is quoting. As long as there are slaughterhouses in this world, there will be war. There will be anarchy. There will be mental depression, all sorts of problems. The only thing you and I cannot correlate that. That's the problem. When otherwise you're a righteous person. It's not that you, just because you kill an animal, that does not make you the other good actions in your life. But that particular action you can't escape. It will boomerang on you. And then you cannot correlate that. Do you understand the why me? What about that chicken which I ate? Whether organic, humanly, if somebody kills you and me humanly, I mean, will you like that? You come to me and you say, Amit, I will kill you humanly. You look good. I like human meat. So, humanly, I will eat you. Will you sacrifice myself? I say the same thing to you. I am giving you silly, crazy example. You will pay the price. You can't escape the law. That's what happens. I'm glad you it's a good analysis. Why this happened to me? What about all these innocent animals I've been hurting? That fish in the tank, bird in the cage. What about that? Nobody talks about that. Throughout your life, you have been hurting your spouse. Could be anything, You have to pay the price. You can't escape. So don't worry about all this at this moment. Get this knowledge, decide to become a better human being. You can wipe out your past. That's the power we have. Forget about what we have been doing so far. Anytime you want to change your bank balance, if you're in debt, you can wipe out your debts, isn't it? So why worry about a debt? Of course, understand that I'm in debt because of it's my own doing. From now on, as far as my finances are concerned, I'm not going to function in indiscriminate ways. I mean, very soon your bank balance will be positive. So don't worry about the past. But if you continue like that, obviously you will pay the price. This is where we apply ourselves in life. Vedanta is not just theoretical discussion. Why are you not peaceful? Why I'm not peaceful? For argument's sake. How can you be peaceful when you are keeping a bird in a cage? Are you with me? During COVID time, people were afraid. Nobody knew whether it is going to be who is next. Isn't it? I heard so many people, they're so worried. Why are you so worried? What about that chicken who is in that cage? The 10 chickens there, the butcher picks up one by one. The chicken does not know whether it is my turn next. What that animal must be going through, that fear. Can you imagine? Same thing is happening to you and me. You can't escape that. You may not know it. I may not know it. There is a price to pay. So therefore, with this knowledge, you become so sensitive, so alert. See, it's not, people don't understand this. Nothing to do with diet, nothing to do with whatever. It's to do with identification with other beings. If you don't identify, you pay the price. The car, when we buy, the first thing I look for in a car is vegan seats. Some of you are aware of, Jigar knows what I'm talking about. Veera, Radha, they know. I wanted to buy a car 5 years back. I mean, it's very difficult to get a car without leather seats. Only 2 or 3 brands you get. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and now Tesla. Some people, they ask me, I like particular brand, I would just buy it. What about leather seats? To that extent, you become aware. To that extent, we need to fine-tune our life. Somebody may say, why? Why go vegan? it sounds extreme. I'm not saying you do that, please. That's not my indication. Find out how you get milk. If it is humanely, I mean, during old time, cows were grazing and no torture. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but find out. I have found out, I mean, I saw that in America, how we get milk. It was a shock for me. I'm not saying others should not. Others should have my lifestyle. There is a price you pay. I will pay. If we are not, don't understand other beings suffering, can't escape. See, that is why when you get this knowledge, when that awareness comes, initially it is difficult. Isn't it? But then that's what transforms your life. You hit the pillow, you sleep within no time. Why? Because you're righteous in everything, all facets of your life. So I gave a very broad answer, but it's a good analysis which you not usually people don't bring up such analysis. So I appreciate Madeline for doing that. Is group okay?
That Deva uncle has a question.
Please.
Amit, the question is regard to one act that I commit today. And my question is that act is an effect, and should I examine the past and look for the cause of it? Or is that the cause that I'm sowing today, and be prepared for, with this Vedantic knowledge, be prepared in future for the effect of it. If it's positive, positive, negative, negative.
See, if you know the cause, then of course you should.
Okay.
But if you cannot, don't worry about it.
Okay.
I mean, it's a waste of time. It's like, yes, I bought something impulsively in the past, therefore that I'm paying the price. That much you understand. So though I'm good person, God's good man, like they say, but in spite of that, there are a few negative things happening in my life. So definitely I must have done something in the past. That is guaranteed. There is a cause. Now, why unnecessarily bother about that cause and worry about it? So focus on becoming a better human being from now onwards. For every action, you have a choice. Whether that action is positive or negative, that nobody can deny that to you.
Right.
So focus on the present causes rather than worrying about unknown cause in the past.
Okay.
That's the scope of that example. But understand that there is a cause for which you're paying the price. No third party is responsible. My stars are bad. God has cursed me. There is no such thing. Your own action is responsible. You're paying the price because of your own past action. That's the cause. That much you understand, and then resolve on getting this knowledge and becoming a better human being. That is how it works.
So should I analyze my today's action? If it's negative, be prepared in future for the effect of that?
It has to. If I do something negative right now, how can I not pay the price? But I have control on my present action, isn't it?
Right.
Past action is fait accompli. Even if you regret, what can you do?
Right.
Fine, you regret is good, but point is, it's not always possible to know the cause. If you analyze things like, from the age of 14, 15, 16, I mean, how many times, so it's not worth it. What we need to understand is you can't escape law of causation.
Yeah.
So forget about the past.
Look, I'll help you.
Sorry? So did somebody say something?
Someone's mic was not muted.
Oh, okay. So if you look at the past, then you will become pessimistic. It's a negative way of functioning, right? If you look at the future, you can wipe out your past. It's the capacity we all have. But education, this is for the sake of education. First of all, understand that whatever is happening to you in your life, me in my life, anybody, is based on cause and effect. You can't escape that. Therefore, he says that you reap what you sow. That understanding is enough. But you have control on your present life right now, present action. So the future is in your hands, isn't it?
Right.
That's the message here.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Video
Are we okay?
Yeah,
Group is
Manjula
okay?
auntie has a question.
Who?
Manjula auntie.
Yeah. I can't see. Yeah, please. Yes.
Suppose somebody has a lot of anger towards one's parents,
Right.
and he or she was not treated very well, or so how does, and the person carries on throughout life that anger. Parents are gone. The person is suffering like anything. But my question is, does asking, even if he realizes or somebody tells him, asking forgiveness from parents for that anger for the whole life, does that voids, does that karma, that he has accumulated over against parents, does that nullifies if he asks for forgiveness, even if they're gone, but just ask for in his, from their souls, does that nullify that karma? That is my question.
Now, see, you are giving another example to explain law of cause and effect.
Yes.
This is what you are doing. So that's not a way to understand. See, let's say somebody ill treats you. So that person, he is showing the cause for which he is paying the price. They have to pay the price, whoever that person is. You may do to that children, you may do to your spouse. You can't escape that. Now, I being the victim, if I entertain negative feelings towards you, I will have to pay the price for that. As a human being, you have that capacity of forgiveness, of understanding. So if you understand that if you don't entertain negative feelings, as far as you are concerned, you are sowing positive seeds, even you went through negative experience. Asking the person who did something negative, that person may not even regret. He may say, okay, you deserved it. I wish I should have kicked you more. So what? You don't have to worry about that. You are responsible for your life. Your parents are responsible for their life. Every human being is responsible for his or her life. If you do something positive, you reap positive. You do something negative, you get something negative. So you have control on your life. So you have that capacity to entertain either negative feelings or
positive
feelings. So if you entertain positive feelings, genuinely you come out of it. And understand that, yes, they were good, but maybe something they did to me which I don't understand, or maybe you don't understand. So-called negative, maybe actually it is positive. If you ask me, as a child, number of times I got beating from my mother. It was a routine. That time, I used to create, a few times I created a scene, but today I thank God that my mother beat me. If she had
So
not
that
beaten
is-
me, I would have, I don't know, I would have become, I'm magnifying, That time I did not understand.
So this is what my question is. Sometimes we feel that parents do their best to their knowledge and their resources, but the child can think that he's being treated unfairly and biasedly. So and you carry on with those feelings for the rest of your life, and everything you do wrong is because you were treated like that. So how do you bring this person to understand this whole whole this karma theory?
Knowledge, theory, no, is a law. Therefore, you need knowledge. You cannot blame anybody for what is happening to you in your life, positive or negative. Yes, somebody did something negative to you. So that act per se is negative. That person will pay the price. But why are you paying the price for yourself by entertaining negative feelings? If you do that, you will pay the price. So you have that choice. Your reaction could be positive, your reaction could be negative at a mental level. When it comes to physical level, it depends on the situation. Somebody picks your pocket. I am giving you an example, right? So that does not mean you keep going to the area where there are pickpockets. That is foolish. But to entertain negative feeling, these, pardon my language, bloody thieves, this and that. That is one way of reacting. Second way of reacting is they're ignorant. They don't have proper knowledge in life. See, that Maurice Maeterlinck's fascinating quote, it will help you to understand this. He says, happy and blessed are. Happy and blessed are, meaning you are happy, you're mentally peaceful. When you understand wickedness is nothing but goodness bereft of a guide. Happy and blessed art, when you understand wickedness is nothing but goodness bereft of a guide. When you see something unrighteous, when you see something negative in life, one thing is to curse. Why this, including it, they might have victimized you. The correct way of understanding that this knowledge only it is possible, you understand that they are ignorant people. Now, there you go. Happy and blessed hour, meaning you are happy, you are peaceful. When wickedness stands forth revealed as goodness bereft of its guide. Bereft means without. Everybody is good, but certain acts they do where they are ignorant. They don't have proper guide in life. They don't have higher values of life. Therefore, they have done something negative. That's the right way to view unrighteous things in the world, which may include you also. You might have been the victim of that. But if you entertain negative feelings, you will pay the price. You entertaining negative feelings towards those people is the cause you sow. Effect is your own peace is destroyed. That you can't escape. They will pay the price. Other person, though the perpetrator of negative action will pay the price, cause and effect. You also will pay the price if you entertain negative feelings. So that cause and effect you can't escape. So you need to understand that I have that capacity to forgive that person mentally. If you don't do that, you are creating a negative cause, and there will be negative effect, which is like mentally disturbed, frustrated, whatever it may be. Direct cause and effect.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Mandy.
you.
Good. So I'm glad a lot of questions were there today. So only by question and answer we can learn. Great. So let's conclude for today, and I'll see you next week. So we'll start chapter 2, Born in Captivity. See you next week.
Thank you, Amity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.